Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this historical Royal Aeronautical Society lecture on Fledglings of the Third Reich by Dr. Victoria Taylor. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Howard Mason. I chair the Aeronautical Heritage Specialist Group of the Society and have the honour of many of our members sitting around here today because we've had a meeting this afternoon to look at the programme of lectures we have going forward into 2025. So, quick advert for your diary. Our next lecture will be on the 26th of September, and it will look at the secret projects of Westland. And Dr. Ron Smith, who's here, will be presenting on that with his co-author of the book. So, please keep your eyes open for a continuing string of lectures going forward. Right, normally here I would have to give the parish notices for housekeeping, but the Royal Aeronautical Society has a new video, which they will now play.
Hello and welcome to number 4 Hamilton Place, the home of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Your safety is important to us. We'd like to take a moment to remind you of our essential building safety procedures. There are no planned fire alarm tests during today's event. Therefore, if the alarm sounds, please leave the building by your nearest available exit. Please do not use the lift when exiting in an emergency. If you have mobility or access issues, please make yourself known to a member of our team so that we can make necessary arrangements for your safe exit from the building. Our designated assembly point is the paved area at the junction of Hamilton Place and Piccadilly, just beyond the Intercontinental Hotel. Society staff will be on hand to guide you. In order to avoid distractions for your fellow attendees, please make sure that you turn all mobile phones and devices to silent or off. Please ensure you don't leave any bags or personal items unattended, and please do report anything suspicious to our team. If the event has an opportunity for questions, please raise your hand and wait for a member of the team to bring you a microphone before speaking. Some events may have a fixed microphone on a stand. If so, please ask your question there. If you need any assistance at all, please don't hesitate to ask one of our team who will be happy to help you. Thank you for your attention, and once again, welcome to the Royal Aeronautical Society.
You can't say fairer than that. I think all I have left to do is demonstrate the use of the sick bag. Right, our speaker tonight, Dr. Victoria Taylor, is a member of the Aeronautical Heritage Specialist Group and is part of the editorial board for the Journal of Aeronautical History. Among her other talents, she's a member of the advisory board for the cross-party Spitfire AA-810 restoration project in the House of Lords and has delivered teaching on air power to RAF officers as part of the Joint Services Command and Staff College courses at the Defence Academy at Shrivenham. She's an associate of the Freeman Air and Space Institute, based at the School of Security Studies at King's College London, as well as an ambassador for both the National Spitfire Project and the Royal Air Force Charitable Trust, hence the tag spitfirephilly.com. She's an award-winning aviation historian who completed her PhD on the Luftwaffe and National Socialism in the Third Reich at the University of Hull and Sheffield Hallam. Her main historical focus is on British and German aviation during the interwar period and the Second World War. In recognition of her PhD research, she was awarded the 2020 Royal Air Force Museum Doctoral Academic Prize in 2021. Also completed her Masters in Historical Research on Britain's wartime and post-war mythologisation of Operation Chastise, the Dambusters RAeS, for which she was awarded the RAF Museum's RAF Centenary Masters Academic Prize in 2019. So I think you'll agree there is no one who will be better qualified to talk about perhaps a little-known area of the Luftwaffe's training for the Second World War. Victoria.
Well, thank you so much for that, Howard, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending tonight. My sincerest thanks, of course, go to the Royal Aeronautical Society and to the Aeronautical Heritage Specialist Group for hosting this lecture. And it's also really lovely to speak on a different subject. I've been sort of hiding away in the shadows working on a book, which is due to come out next year in time for a certain big 85th anniversary. So it's nice to have a change of subject, and it's also nice to remember what people actually look like in real life. So now the work of the National Socialist Flyers Corps is bearing its fruits for the benefit of the Luftwaffe, and thus for German air legitimacy, for the good of the German people and their future. Oberstleutnant Hermann Adler's assessment of the National Socialistisches Flyers Corps, or the National Socialist Flyers Corps, the NSFK, encapsulated its intended role as an effective preparatory school for the main Luftwaffe. The NSFK instructed young German and Austrian boys between 14 and 18 years old, especially within the Flieger Hitlerjugend, or the Aviation Hitler Youth, in everything from aeronautical theory and wireless communications to maintenance work and gliding, whilst keeping its instructors fit for the future air war. Now, its study has often been sidelined in favour of the National Socialist Motor Corps, or the NSFK. And this lopsided scrutiny may stem from the fact that actually the NSFK appears to have been a much larger organisation than the NSFK. And although there were 2,400 NSFK members that were present at the September 1938 Nuremberg rally, this figure ends up being dwarfed by the 12,000 NSFK members who also attended that event. Now, Dorothy Hochstetter has attributed this numerical discrepancy to the fact that since the NSFK members had to either have their own aircraft or at least a pilot's license, the potential membership was correspondingly small. And H.W. Koch adds that the German government was loath to allocate additional funds which would have allowed the purchase of the amount of equipment necessary. And so the NSFK's endemic financial shortage brought about the rather undesirable development of having to buy their own gliders and aircraft. The organisation enticed the nation's youth towards becoming aviators by arranging concerts, meet and greets with heroic veteran pilots from the First World War, and youth gliding competitions. But most notably, it sought to intertwine all of this with this idea of Flugbegeisterung, or air-mindedness, with quintessential National Socialism. And from circulating anti-Semitic articles to nurturing fondness for the German folk, the NSFK strove to politically indoctrinate its thousands of members and the youth they instructed in order to create this new generation that would fly for both the Führer and the fatherland. Now, wartime Allied intelligence estimated that it had trained as many as 40% of the men serving in the Luftwaffe by September 1939, so around 8,000 personnel. And this wartime Allied documentation does need to be viewed with the potential for alarmist overstatement, and also its sort of quantitative unreliability can be seen in the figures that it had. So it had cited a number of 18,000 men serving in the Luftwaffe by the autumn of 1939, and this was massively underestimating the true figure of 15,000 officers in the Luftwaffe and 370,000 men amongst the other ranks. But failing to consider the NSFK's influence on the Luftwaffe is to simplify our understanding of the main German Air Force's political and its military makeup. And so this talk aims to shed light on how the NSFK delivered aeronautical and political training to Luftwaffe aspirants in the Hitler Youth, before determining how successfully integrated its training was with Luftwaffe requirements for new recruits. So, before we go into the history of the NSFK specifically, it is important to begin with a brief overview of civil gliding and flying clubs in Germany prior to its main consolidation in 1937. Reflecting the increasing popularity surrounding Zeppelins and dirigibles in Germany at the start of the 20th century, the Deutsche Luftschifferverband, the DLV or the German Airship Association, was founded in 1902. And around this time, the Deutsche Luftfahrtverein, or the German Aviation Club, also DLV, was founded. And the exponential public interest within aviation could be seen in how the original DLV expanded and it evolved into the Deutsche Luftfahrerverband, or the German Aviation Association, in 1911. And this organization ended up hitting 78,000 members within 88 different branches by 1913. And this reflects how, in Sabine Hüller's words, how the DLV had become one of the largest sporting associations in Germany. And as a result, it enjoyed this position of considerable economic and scientific importance. And the glider and sports plane clubs that had blossomed in the interwar period in defiance of German aviation restrictions as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. All of these different organizations were then unified into the Deutsche Luftfahrtverband, or the German League for Aeronautics, in 1922. This new DLV ended up giving scientific lectures in the winter, giving practical flight instruction in the summer, and it was a really important means of supporting early gliding training of pilots that were earmarked for the Schwarze Luftwaffe, or the Shadow Luftwaffe. And this was being surreptitiously developed by successive Weimar governments, and of course it would later be hijacked by the Nazis upon their takeover of power in 1933. Now, the National Socialist Flyers Corps was originally founded in January 1932 with the Nazi Party's regulation sheet of the Sturmabteilung High Command, or the SR, determining on the 30th of November 1931 that its purpose was the promotion of German aviation, particularly the nurturing of air sports. It is to create the technical and the administrative conditions for the preparation of the Fliegerstürmer, or the flying storms, and the squadrons of our Sturmabteilung. It added that since this goal can be achieved only with the tightest amalgamation of all forces, it must be endeavoured that all SR and SS men, so the Schutzstaffel, who are involved in flying are transferred to the NSFK as far as possible, along with those who are active in aviation organisations before and during the First World War, and those who were or are active as pilots, observers, etc. And so this demonstrates how both the SR and the SS, these fanatical Nazi organizations, had had a keen influence on the early NSFK, illustrating its politically extreme roots. The NSFK's first commander was none other than Hermann Göring, who you may have heard of, who became its president on the 1st of January 1932, and who would, of course, later become the commander-in-chief of the National Socialist Luftwaffe. But appointed as the Reich Commissioner of Aviation only 3 days after Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Göring had quickly intervened in the proposed fusion of the existing civil flight organizations within the Deutsche Luftfahrtverband. So instead, he pushed for a new organization, the Deutsche Luftsportverband, to replace the old DLV in March 1933. And so on the 25th of March, the NSFK was absorbed into this organization. But the NSFK was not happy about it. There was an official NSFK guide from 1942 that would later complain that the DLV had no direct relationship to the Nazi Party, and that the individual DLV man found no local recognition of his work, and especially not from the party, as the DLV had been structured in line with the needs of the state and of the Luftwaffe. From 1933, the Nazi Party pulled together all of the nation's aeronautical resources and its governing bodies for entire German flying groups for adults into the DLV. And as Peter Fritzsche has noted, there were a few DLV aviators that balked at this political influence. They chafed at the Nazis' sudden domination of a sport with a long-established nationalist pedigree, and they even demanded that a non-partisan branch of the DLV should be founded. But it's important to recognise that this DLV was not devoid of Nazi influence. So there was a bit of grumbling, a bit of complaining, but the organisation quickly bowed to the will of their Nazi masters, and swastikas were soon applied to the fins and the rudders of the DLV's gliders from 1934. Now, Bruno Lürzer, who once served as the DLV's president, tried to insist after the war that the organisation had been apolitical. And Lürzer had claimed in a 1933 article that the DLV has set itself the task of educating our youngsters to become good pilots. And it also wants to spread the idea of German aviation to the broadest circles of our peers. Yet incriminatingly, he also described German aviation in the article as being the most lively bearer of National Socialist performance in the new German Reich. And although the Nazi influence on the DLV was undeniable, it is possible that it was reformed into the NSFK in 1937 due to the party's dissatisfaction over the DLV's inconsistent political views. And so, on the 17th of April 1937, Adolf Hitler ends up resurrecting the National Socialist Flyers Corps from the DLV's ashes. And the NSFK handbook would later claim that everything had to be developed out of the slightest beginnings, almost out of nothing. It had identified the DLV's main task as having been clear and distinct, but also huge: cooperation in the reconstruction of German aviation. The re-establishment of the NSFK in 1937 under Generalflieger Friedrich Christiansen, who had been a naval flying ace from the First World War, had thus been deemed necessary to realise this main ambition. Was founded as a public body and not as an official Nazi party formation, although looking at the uniforms you think, pretty Nazi. The NSFK was still tightly controlled by the party, and it ended up adopting a paramilitary structure which was similar to that of the SA. And it started at the Aviator, or the candidate, with the first official rank being the NSFK Mann. So this was equivalent to sort of a Flieger in the Luftwaffe. And this progressed all the way up to Corps Führer, or the equivalent of a Generalfeldmarschall in the Luftwaffe. Now, both Göring and Christiansen had often emphasized that all German aviators should be erst Nationalsozialist, dann Flieger, or a National Socialist first and then a flyer. And Adler had claimed in 1938 that it is fundamental that all educators and Militärschüler, or military students, are regular members of the Hitler Youth. And so this demonstrated that air-mindedness in the Third Reich was now considered a political means rather than just an aspirational end in itself. And once the National Socialist Flyers Corps eventually absorbed the DLV, it started to ramp up its politicization of German civil flight. So this is an edition of Deutsche Luftwaffe, and this was known as German Air Watch in English. It was the NSFK's flagship publication. And the Führer, or the patrons of the NSFK, automatically received this publication every month, meaning that it was also received by Luftwaffe personnel who donated to the NSFK. There were 3 versions of the magazine published. This is Luftwelt, which was a little bit more conversationalist, the world of aviation. And there was also the more technical Luftwehr, or air defense, and Luftwissen, or aviation science. But it was all of these various anti-Semitic rants that were published in Luftwelt, which you think would be more technical, that revealed the true extent of National Socialist influence within the NSFK. And in an edition of Deutsche Luftwaffe from the 1st of February 1942, it begins with, relatively standard coverage of a school flight exhibition in Vienna. But then straight after that, there is a full-length article entitled Die Kenntnis der Juden, or Knowledge of the Jews. And it laments that hundreds of thousands of German families would not have lost property, land, or workshops if they'd had a real knowledge of the Jews. It was only due to their ignorance of the Jewish rogue that they could be tricked by the Jew again and again. And in addition to this propaganda, NSFK members sang Nazi songs in order to boost their sense of in-rank camaraderie and morale, such as the swastika in the white field, a Hitler man went out, and we are the swastika army. And most sickeningly, the song Brothers in Mines and Pits calls for its singers to load the empty rifles, load with powder and lead, shoot at the fatherland's traitors, down with the Jewish tyranny. And so such material illustrates the vitriolic National Socialist propaganda that the NSFK's members were exposed to as part of its bonding process and its sense of Nazi community. Göring had claimed in a Reich Defense Council meeting from the 18th of November 1938 that it is important to steer the young people right from the start, to shift from unnecessary skills to necessary skills, to make use of every human power source in every form. But it's worth noting that this amalgamation of Germany's flying clubs did not go without a hitch. The University Institute for Physical Exercise, for instance, had attempted to instill these special NSFK factions into existing university flying associations, or the Akademische Fliegergruppen, after 1937. But the Department of Aviation at the Philipps-Universität Marburg actually ended up clashing with the University Institute for Physical Exercise and the NSFK over this practice. And according to Alexander Prieber, chronic issues flared up regarding aircraft storage and use, the sharing and the repair of excessively strained aerodromes, and also the validity of NSFK training plans regarding the proportion of workshop training allocated. In time, of course, this would be exacerbated further by the shortages in resources as a result of the Second World War. And so this did hamper the training of Germany's young aviators to a certain degree. But it's undeniable that the NSFK gave its youth a fundamental grounding in aeronautics, which served as an important first step for many Luftwaffe aspirants. And there are some examples of young men in their 20s who ended up taking flying lessons with the NSFK in order to join the Luftwaffe. But it mainly focused on trying to instruct young boys within the Aviation Hitler Youth, aged between 14 and 18 years old. And it administered training in gliding and constructing model aircraft, competitive sport, also Pflichtflüge, or mandatory flying, and fitness classes. And the long-standing ambition of these young boys to learn to fly was demonstrated by the fact that only securing the second A2 gliding proficiency certificate cost 3,000 Reichsmarks. And such was the ardent desire for these young men to learn that they ended up either using up all their money, their family's money, or they even borrowed money in order to chase their dream. Now, in order to equip Germany's pupils with both theoretical and practical flight experience, the DLV had been instructing schoolboys from 1934, and this was, of course, carried into the NSFK. And such was the popularity of aviation in the earlier Hitler Youth that 1,500 Hitler Youth boys had participated in the annual model gliding competition of 1936. Reflecting this increasing demand, the Flieger Hitler Jugend, the Aviation Hitler Youth, was created as a specialist branch for Germany's air-minded youth. And a 1938 yearbook for the Luftwaffe made the Flieger Hitler Jugend's pre-military nature abundantly clear. It said, "Every Luftwaffe recruit knows that the fulfillment of his service with the Wehrmacht is based on the will to live from the entire Volk. Every Pimpf or Jungvolk boy who enters the Hitler Youth is aware that he is not only fulfilling a wish that is perfectly understandable for a right-wing boy, but that his further years of development are now subject to the brazen law in which men like Bölker and Richthofen found their heroic fulfillment. So I'm now actually going to turn towards a fascinating source from the Royal Aeronautical Society that was kindly shared with me by our own Dr. Peter Elliott, which bestows us with an insight into the kind of instructional resources at the NSFK's disposal, and which actually gives us a link between the NSFK and the Royal Aeronautical Society. Just after the Second World War, Brigadier Jack Parham, who was part of the Second Army of the Royal Artillery, actually taught a former NSFK training centre. Now, although it had been heavily damaged during their crossing of the Elbe, Parham noted that there was still enough to show that a remarkable place it had once been. As an aviation enthusiast, he wrote to the Royal Aeronautical Society on the 5th of June 1945 that when I was going around, I discovered to my astonishment an Alexander Lippisch smoke wind tunnel. This is a simplified form of the one which Lippisch described in that frightfully interesting lecture at the Royal Aeronautical Society in December 1938, and which I attended. Parham added that the thing was in some miraculous way undamaged, and it works most beautifully. I think it would be a most arable tunnel for any of your people who are lecturing, and I therefore propose, if you will accept it, to give it to the Royal Aeronautical Society. And to this end, I've got a clearance with the RAF that they will not lay claim to it for their technicians. I don't know if the Royal Aeronautical Society still has this wind tunnel. I don't know. Maybe we need to look in the catalogue. In addition to this, he also identified how far ahead the NSFK had been in constructing model aeroplanes with much smaller 6cc and 3cc diesel model aeroplane motors. And Parham notes of having informed the RAF that the ingenious Hun has made one of this minute size by doing away with the fuel injection pump altogether and concocting fuel which will ignite itself at the temperature and pressure reached. Now, it may seem as if this is a small detail, but it actually demonstrates the kind of technological innovations that the NSFK was exposing its youth to, and how it augmented their air-mindedness through practical instruction. The first year of NSFK training offered instruction in navigation, in meteorology, in aviation instruments and motors, in aviation geography, international aviation laws and regulations, and air currents. And then in the second year, they moved on to glider flying and parachute jumping. Competitive sports were encouraged, with skiing in particular being promoted due to its need for core strength, balance, and coordination, all physical attributes that lent favourably to flying practice. The NSFK offered a variety of gliding, wireless operation, aircraft modelling, ballooning, and skiing proficiency badges. Now, as you can see on the left here, the proficiency test progressed from A to the final certification in the C test, with several subcategories in between. And in gliding, for instance, the A test required that the candidate could fly solo for 30 seconds without manoeuvres. The Segelflieger B, or the B certificate, required a 60-second solo flight with an S term, and the C certificate required a 5-minute solo flight without losing altitude and a subsequent oral examination. The glider proficiency badges were an immense source of pride for many of Germany's young aviators, and the decorated Luftwaffe fighter ace Adolf Galland had joined the Gelsenkirchen Luftsportverein as a student in 1941. He spoke of how the deep blue badge with the white seagull, which I was allowed to wear proudly in the buttonhole after passing the so-called A test, was much more important to me than some of the more advanced and prestigious glider qualifications that he subsequently achieved. So, now that we have a clearer understanding of how the NSFK administered its aeronautical training to youths in the Third Reich, we're able to consider how well it prepared these young boys for careers in the Luftwaffe. An issue of the Luftwaffe magazine Der Adler, or the Eagle magazine, from the 18th of April 1939, openly declared that many thousands of Hitler Youth boys are ready to fly for the Luftwaffe, and once old enough will follow the call of the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief and rush under his banner. In the Flieger Hitlerjugend, a more dutiful and military-like mindset started to be instilled within its adolescent members by their NSFK tutors. And any Flieger Hitlerjugend boys who illustrated extraordinary potential were made a future Fernreich, or an officer cadet, to ensure that the Luftwaffe had priority over their selection once they were old enough for military service. But where the NSFK started to get in its own way politically is that the young Luftwaffe aspirants were not automatically preferred if they did not show a susceptibility to political conditioning. And according to Der Adler magazine, it was in the aviation Hitler Youth that a young aviator received his ideological and his defence training. And the NSFK admitted that it prefers these, quote, excellently trained boys to volunteers or a Fernreich, an officer cadet, due to their malleability in both respects. And so here we can start to see the early potential for how politics started to eclipse the flying talent within the NSFK. This education was also being imposed on air-minded students at the Fliegertechnische Vorschulen, or the aviation technical preschools, and the Militärschulen, the military schools. But where future Luftwaffe talent was more effectively identified and nurtured by the NSFK was in aircraft factories and in aeronautical engineering. And as Parham wrote to the Royal Aeronautical Society on the 5th of June 1945, the NSFK training centre that he had trained, quote, batches of 100 youths to build a graduated series of model aircraft whilst absorbing a good foundation of simple aerodynamics. Speaking with the chief inspector of the site, Parham added that, quote, they then went into the Luftwaffe, or, in the case of particularly bright boys, to assist in the design staff of aircraft firms. And he said his 10 brightest had gone to Dr. Lippisch, who was working for the Messerschmitt company. So by headhunting young talent for the Luftwaffe as early as possible, the NSFK sought to prime its fledgling eagles for the air war. It rewarded the skill with prospects, with enthusiasm, was rewarded with opportunity, and commitment with a sense of community that the Nazis hoped would be replicated in the Luftwaffe. Now, the extent to which this training actually translated successfully into the Luftwaffe is a bit more debatable. And certainly the NSFK's Corps Führer was directly answerable to the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe. And this demonstrated the strong organisational link between the two. Many of its members were, of course, with the Luftwaffe, and the NSFK was open to any Reich citizens who were trained pilots, observers, balloonists, or reservists of the Luftwaffe, providing that they could prove their pure German or Aryan ancestry back to the year 1750. That they, good luck with that. That they were sufficiently fit and under 45 years of age, and that they had an unblemished character that embraced National Socialism, which I think, well, if any character is going to be blemished, it's one that supports National Socialism. And the NSFK noted that the Luftwaffe is proud that in Germany there are many tens of thousands of aviation-loving, volunteering NSFK leaders and men who give their time for free to train the young airmen for the flying troop. NSFK officers who were actually part of the Luftwaffe held double ranks, with their NSFK rank always being one higher than that in the Luftwaffe. And indeed, some of the most prominent Luftwaffe pilots of the time had links to the NSFK, with personnel including Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, who held the rank of Gruppenführer in the NSFK from 1944. And of course, Lutzer, who I've already mentioned, is another example. At the bare minimum, there are at least 80 known senior Luftwaffe officers who either formally worked with or were members of the NSFK. It's likely, of course, to be higher amongst the other ranks, as is the Luftwaffe personnel who interacted more informally with the Fliegerhitlerjugend and the NSFK. There's actually a number of former NSFK personnel who had been decorated First World War fighter aces, such as Julius Buckler, who was an NSFK unit leader in 1937, and he was later a Luftwaffe Special Duties officer at the Jagdfliegerschule, or the fighter pilot school in Werneuchen. This was also the case with the former Luftstreitkräfte fighter ace Ludwig Lutz Beckmann, who was later awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on the 14th of March, 1943, as a commander of the Luftwaffe Transport Group Kampfgruppe ZBW 500, and he had formerly served with both the SR and the NSFK in the 1930s. Other personnel included Hans Horn, the World War I flyer and the recipient of the Pour le Mérite, who was recalled to active Luftwaffe duty in 1938, and he was a Führer of a Standrate in the NSFK during the 1930s. He later went on to be a National Socialist leader officer in the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. Hans-Joachim Klug was head of an NSFK school and later flew with Jagdgeschwader, or Fighter Wing 52, between 1940 and 1941. There was Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Tarzan Hoffmann, a Bf-109F pilot who'd begun training with the NSFK at 23 years of age, and who ended up joining the Luftwaffe the next year. He later flew with Jagdgeschwader 51 and 52, and he also later ended up being awarded the Knight's Cross. It should be noted, though, that those who had learnt to fly or who had instructed with the NSFK were more than just fighter or bomber pilots. There was, for instance, the Junkers 87 Stuka pilot Helmut Boder, who later commanded the 3rd Gruppe of Sturzkampfgeschwader 77 and who also won the Knight's Cross. He had joined the NSFK at its inception in 1932. There was also the aviation pioneer Generalmajor Karl Freiherr von Gablenz. He was a veteran of the Fliegertruppe in the First World War. He ends up joining the NSFK from its inception. He then becomes a Lufthansa pilot and a technical advisor, and he becomes a transport pilot in the Second World War. And finally, perhaps one of the most dotted careers was Elimar Meyer-Wehner. He started off as a flight instructor in the NSFK, and he entered the Luftwaffe in August 1939, and then ends up being a transport pilot who was involved in the Gran Sasso raid to liberate Benito Mussolini. So the ranks of the NSFK were not just merely staffed with amateurs, with amateur flight enthusiasts, but also with mentors and instructors who either had already had or went on to illustrious careers in the Luftwaffe and within aviation more generally. So there was this close cooperation between the Luftwaffe, between the Aviation Hitler Youth and the NSFK. And this was incredibly important for securing the next generation of technical talent for the main Luftwaffe. With the outbreak of the Second World War, after Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the symbiotic relationship becomes of paramount importance. Now, I've actually brought a couple of wartime propaganda books, which I'm going to pass along. They are original NSFK books. The book has got pictures you need to flick through a little bit more. The pamphlet is a picture book. And this starts to give you an idea of what its members and what its students were given. So if you want to have a flick through, as I say, they are from 1942, so please handle them carefully. They are a bit flaky now, but it will give you an idea. And it's particularly emphasized in one of the books we have today, which is Wir fliegen in Wind und Wolken, or We Fly in Wind and Clouds. And it claimed that on October the 7th, 1939, Hermann Göring issued the order regarding the tasks of the National Socialist Flyers Corps during the war. And with this order, the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe transferred the selection and the pre-military flight training of the next generation of the Luftwaffe to the NSFK. And it sought to promote the Luftwaffe in terms of aviation and technology, and to bind and secure these parts of the German youth who were spurred on by the successful deployment of the Luftwaffe. The training is carried out in close cooperation with the Hitler Youth. Now, such was this wartime connection between the two organisations that existing NSFK membership was often associated with higher chances of actually being accepted by the Luftwaffe. Following his Luftwaffe administration's interview, the bomber pilot Karl Engel remembered that all the other applicants had started swirling around him and asking, what about the National Socialist Flyers Corps? Do they want to know if you're a member? Oberstleutnant Adler proudly declared that the careful selection of the suitable boys, their guidance by teachers of the NSFK, and their pre-military training have found confirmation and recognition in the war. Great is the number of boys annually growing in this way in the Luftwaffe. And it wasn't, of course, just future pilots of the NSFK that were being produced, but in-flight mechanics, glider-borne paratroopers, radio operators, and anti-aircraft gunners. But as a staunch National Socialist serving in the Luftwaffe, we do need to cautiously analyse Adler's assessment. And the Luftwaffe didn't actually formally recognise any pilot licences from the NSFK, even though the NSFK and the Luftwaffe's instructors often assisted one another with each other's training and their examinations. But there could be some intriguing exceptions. So the NSFK's special Bordfunkerschein, or its wireless operator's license, was awarded in line with Luftwaffe requirements, and its tests were supervised by Luftwaffe personnel. So obtaining this certificate enabled the recipient to join an air signals unit as a special technician when he signed up to the Luftwaffe. But a former Flakhelfer or an anti-aircraft assistant in the Luftwaffe, Georg Kurz, recalled that the iron discipline of the NSFK produced highly motivated, if insufficiently advanced offspring for the Luftwaffe. After 1939, the ranks of the NSFK were severely depleted due to the war, as it ended up drawing away many of its best instructors, with both the Luftwaffe and the Reichspost, or the Postal Administration, having to supplement the NSFK with their own instructors. So there was a real patchy and a non-standardized level of pre-military training for the students that could vary considerably in quality. And of course, this was compounded by the wartime commandeering of NSFK aircraft for the Luftwaffe. But despite these few shortcomings, the NSFK undoubtedly served as an effective springboard for some Luftwaffe aspirants by equipping them with fundamental aeronautical knowledge and transferable skills. That these Luftwaffe recruits had often been politically as well as militarily primed by the NSFK is a damning blow to the post-war clean Wehrmacht myth that the Luftwaffe has often benefited from. There was a ramping in National Socialist rhetoric, like in the Luftwaffe, during the NSFK's final years, because where an average of 60 to 70 pupils had been passing through the NSFK each month earlier in the war, this had very much dropped to between 16 and 17 pupils a month by the end of 1944. And there's an intriguing Allied intelligence document from the 14th of June 1945, which recalls the interrogation of Obersturmführer Josef Kapunich, who was second in command of an NSFK Standarte 113 in Klagenfurt, Austria. Now, Kapunich testified in his interrogation that he had heard General de Flieger Adolf Dickfeld inform Goering that the German Air Force as such was finished and that there was no need to continue training in the NSFK. But a sense of fanaticism within the NSFK was most keenly seen when its Corps Führer by the end of the war, General Oberst Alfred Keller there on the left, had intended to remedy the Luftwaffe's mounting losses by throwing NSFK-trained Fliegerhitlerjugend boys against the Allied invasion. The head of training in the NSFK allegedly called on all German stations and the youth with a message for the Flieger Hitlerjugend. The Luftwaffe doesn't need the technical flyer alone. Rather, it needs the flying National Socialists. Galland claimed that the nation's young student pilots wanted to try, even in the face of total military defeat, to prevent the destruction of the homeland. Now, the intention was to train these young aviation Hitler Youth boys to fly in gliders like the Stummelhabicht, which looked somewhat like and flew somewhat like the Heinkel HE-162, the so-called Volksjäger, or the People's Fighter. And this would help economize on fuel, which was, of course, now getting desperately short by 1944, and allow the young boys to get a feel for their future fighter aircraft. According to Galland, Keller intended on tackling this problem without any technical knowledge, merely aided by his NSFK Standartenführer and his Gruppenführer. But the NSFK looked seriously enough into this problem that on the 25th of October 1944, it requested Heinkel Süd to offer 3 of its most experienced aeronautical designers to create between 10 and 40 training simulators for the HE-162. And during an Oberkommando der Luftwaffe conference on the 16th of November 1944, the conversion training of pilots for the HE-162 was high on the agenda. And the idea was to use a full-scale cabin simulator. There would be mock-up basic instruments that would be used. They'd move on to a more sophisticated simulator, and then eventually a full reconstruction of the HE-162, which would have takeoff and in-flight noise, and an electrically driven BMW 003 turbine. So this only got to the developmental stage, with mere parts being delivered by the beginning of 1945. But it illustrates just how ideologically fanatical the NSFK were in being willing to throw their young Flieger Hitlerjugend boys into the Third Reich's last desperate stand. To conclude then, the National Socialist Flyers Corps was able to wield a significant amount of both military and political control over the thousands of students who passed through its ranks, influencing everything from their anti-Semitic views and their support for the Führer to fostering a military brotherhood that was ready for the air war. Along with its blatant appeal to the air-mindedness of its members, the NSFK combined its National Socialist propaganda with an effective and a dedicated pre-military training program. Such training could be inconsistent and, in certain cases, was insufficient. But the NSFK's instructors nevertheless provided a well-rounded foundation for its students that enabled many of them to enjoy successful careers within aviation. It undeniably served as a crucial supplier of keen and ambitious young men for the Luftwaffe, whether their enthusiasm was for politics, for flying, or for a mixture of the two. So it can be concluded that the NSFK was genuinely successful in priming the Reich's pilots for the future air war, both politically and militarily. But in order to fully comprehend the political and the technical makeup of the Luftwaffe, writing the NSFK back into aviation history and into military history allows us to highlight some of the strengths and the weaknesses that the German Air Force wielded in its training and its recruitment. It also helps us to further push back against the enduring notion of the Luftwaffe being largely free from political influence, particularly when we can see its close proximity to an organisation which, as Brigadier Jack Parham reported to the Royal Aeronautical Society in June 1945, was, quote, 100% Nazi and no doubt about it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for Victoria. I think that gives a very interesting insight into a way of encouraging youth to become air-minded, perhaps in a somewhat totalitarian...
Not recommended.
Yes, it's militarising the air cadets, perhaps.
Oh my God.
Okay, Victoria's happy to take questions. Please raise your hand, and Andy will come around with a microphone.
Hi there, thanks for a great presentation. Apart from the fact that the NSFK was obviously highly politicised in the point of view of being a sort of Nazi organisation, how much of an outlier was Germany compared to other countries in terms of having these group societies for advancing aviation among not only people generally but young people for training pilots and things? Was that parallel? Were there parallels like in Britain or America? Or
it was. I mean, sort of. There was this massive boom period. It wasn't just. I mean, I think Germany it was particularly intense because of the Treaty of Versailles and because there had been that stripping away of, military and naval air forces. I think they perhaps had a more hardened, fanatic edge in Germany, but within Britain and America, Britain specifically with its air cadets, it was one of those things where this was very much the glider craze in the 1920s was pretty much universal. And because it was the first time really that people were starting to be able to embrace aviation on a wider scale and to start to understand, the stories of these great machines that they'd heard of in the taking part in the First World War. I think in terms of their uniformity, I think there's far more standardization and consideration in Germany compared to some of the other countries at the time. I think some of this is simply because of it coincides with the National Socialists. There is this kind of early militarization, which is not quite the same in other countries, but it really is everywhere. And when you look at sort of some of the early kind of German flying clubs and things, there's so many photographs of British youths that have come over. These competitions were very much international. They were sort of held around the Wasserkuppe, and all of these areas were very much I wouldn't say celebrated, but it really was an international fascination in this period. So I'd say that there's certainly far more of a paramilitary edge to it earlier on with the Germans than, say, compared to the British. But ultimately, the actual sort of growing and expansion was pretty much international in this period.
Thank you. Another question. Jim.
Hi there, Jim Robinson, Aerospace, coming in the building. Great lecture. Especially the last bit on the salamander and the kind of synthetic training. So was that just for the H162, or was that for Me-262 as well?
I don't know for the Me-262. I don't think so. I think the idea was because of the Volksjäger being a little bit almost user-friendly in a way, and with the Me-262 being particularly volatile in that period, even for experienced pilots. From what I understand, there weren't any sort of simulators for the Me-262, at least intended for the Hitler Youth or for the NSFK. But I think that was basically the idea sort of with the Volksjäger, is that they thought, well, realistically, that if we do put in the Hitler Youth, we can produce more of those than we can the Me-262. So it's sort of a practicality in terms of what could be churned out relatively quickly and how sort of complex it is compared to the two aircraft. So I don't know actually for the Hitler Youth. It'd be interesting to see if they also had an introduction. But as far as I know, the emphasis was on the Volksjäger.
So I'm presuming they were moving directly from a sort of SG-38 into a modern jet fighter. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, these 14 to 18-year-olds, I couldn't see anything going wrong there.
Good. Yes, please. Then one on the back.
Were there any links between the NSFK and the Condor Legion operating in the Spanish Civil War?
That's an interesting question. The Condor Legion, the Spanish Civil War features a lot within its propaganda. There was the link in terms of returning Condor Legion veterans were very much celebrated. There are pictures of meet and greets between the Aviation Hitler Youth and the likes of Gallant, who we'd mentioned. In terms of a direct link, I don't think so much. I think there was still in this period the fact that the Condor Legion had so much secrecy around it to start with. I think it was one of those things that really they kind of had to not be making it more obvious than it really had to be. I mean, the level of detail was absolutely crazy. The sort of the backstories they gave them. They had to pretend they'd been dismissed from the Luftwaffe. It was all of that sort of level. And I think potentially if they'd got sort of the NSFK involved, the sort of aviation Hitler Youth involved, it would have compromised that secrecy even more. So in terms of the actual direct links, whether they were sort of trained for the Condor Legion, I don't know necessarily. I think the NSFK sort of, it does emerge in 1937, so it would coincide with the Spanish Civil War, but I think it's one of those things that really, it was quite an internal Luftwaffe thing, and it was intended to be that way until sort of international coverage clocked on. Yeah.
Thank you. We have one at the back.
Thank you. So, leading up to and during the Second World War, how aware were like Allied forces that all of this training was kind of going on? Were they very much aware of it, or is all of this kind of, have we learned all of this after the fact?
Great question. More than you'd think. We knew more than you'd think. So, I suppose it makes sense to sort of explain immediately after the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. The British were part of the sort of inter-Allied Aviation Commission, and they were involved with the sort of dismantling of the German Luftstreitkräfte, so the Imperial German Flying Service, in the First World War. And so they had to be very much clear on what was being sort of taken. So they weren't always quite so strict with gliding and things like that. That was sort of a way to get around it, because when they'd put in all the sort of motor restrictions and the specific horsepower and all of those elements and weight and altitude, gliding was an easy way to get around it. Now, it's been quite interesting because I've seen some historians that have suggested that, Britain and France in particular were very naive when it came to German aviation. Honestly, some of it is they were quite lazy, and they realized quite soon on that actually they couldn't really enforce that kind of policing. It caused a lot of ill will because right at the end of the First World War, there were incidents where some of the German pilots were deliberately crashing their aircraft when landing, so that, it was almost a way to spite the British and the French authorities. And so as a result, it's one of those things that I think the British knew more, because when you look at their documentation, they notice that some of the gliding groups are sort of speaking out about, oh, actually, I think we should be able to bring commercial aviation, don't you think, and sort of trying to expand civil aviation in other areas. And even by the early 1920s, there are certain British intelligence documents that say we are concerned about this gliding craze because it is starting to show this level of uniformity and this kind of national identity and character in Germany, then Weimar Germany, that is concerning and could be converted to military purposes. And in fact, there's sometimes this correspondence of certain RAF personnel that have gone over to Germany in the interwar period, and they are getting lobbied by German aviators in terms of they're persuaded into, oh, well, you could use our sheds for flying, and you could use us as a halfway house when you're flying European commercial airline routes and things. So as a result, I think we knew more than some historians have acknowledged, and I think it's one of those things that they try to keep an eye on it, but ultimately if they were the ones that didn't want to police it too much, there was one report that said about how this is just a costly process, it's a difficult process, it doesn't help with goodwill, and ultimately we need goodwill if we're going to fly over Germany. So we knew more, but I think it's one of those situations where not really much could be done about it at that time.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Victoria, thank you for a very interesting lecture and the name check. And with regard to the Lippisch smoke tunnel that Jack Parham sent to the Society, if I remember rightly from the file, I think it went to the Science Museum.
Did it? Oh! Oh.
Lost
right.
in Rawton somewhere.
Oops. I find it even funny because, of course, in the document you sent me, of course, you said, oh, can you keep it at the Royal Aeronautical Society so I can come use it every few months or something like that. So clearly, you didn't want it. That's interesting. Thank you for the update.
Thank you. One at the front here, Andy. Oh. Ben got there first.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating lecture. I mean, this is more in the nature of a comment than a question. I'm quite sure there must be other people of my sort of vintage around here who are your magazines that you were passing around. There's this beautiful image of a young man in what I know as a daggling glider with a Y-shaped bungee on the front of it. And I can remember from the 1950s directing groups of cadets across my school playing fields to try and get exactly the same glider into the air for possibly those 20 seconds that would have earned one of these badges. It's an absolutely wonderful experience. These things were fantastic to play with. So I think some of those were probably seized after the war and sent back to the UK to be used in British schools to try and do a similar job to that they'd been doing in the 1930s in Germany.
Well, of course, Eon did produce the Eton, which was a clone of the SG-38, and there's one of those on display at the RAF Museum in the foyer, I seem to recall. I'm bound to be corrected.
Yes, Elliott's of Newbury, no relation by the way, produced the Eton. Slingsby's, a good Yorkshire firm, produced the Grasshopper.
Yes.
Apparently because by that stage the ATC had taken up gliding training for potential aircrew, and they were flying the Cadet Mark 1, which didn't have spoilers on the wings. They then produced, got Slingsby to build wings which did have spoilers, which were then retrofitted to the fuselages, leaving some spare original wings which Slingsby then built fuselages for. And yeah, we had one of those, and we had the Grasshopper at school. And going back to simulators, you could mount it on a tripod with a ball joint.
Yes.
And with a bit of breeze, you could work the controls and all that sort of thing. I never had the courage to fly it because I always wondered what would happen if that elastic rope snapped.
Oh.
Sudden, though not entirely unexpected twang, I seem to remember from the early days of flight.
Could imagine.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, if not, thank you very much, Victoria, for a fascinating lecture. And can we show us some appreciation, please? Now, if you've enjoyed this lecture, watch on the Society pages for an announcement for next May when Victoria's going to come back and talk a little bit about her book, if you'd like to introduce that briefly.
So I'm not sure how much I'm meant to be saying on it, but it's on. It's in time for the big 85th anniversary next year of the Battle of Britain, and it's also be looking at life and death for the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. So it's kind of going more into a sense of not just looking at the classic, fighter pilots, bomber crews, but also looking into the kind of invasion mentality that had been instilled across the Luftwaffe, its ranks and roles, how seriously they thought sea lion was going to happen. So it's pretty much looking into that. It's delving more into alternative sources, some of the letters they sent back home, and kind of looking at assessing their combat motivation and morale. So that will be next year in May for the 85th anniversary.
So you'll be prepared for the Battle of Britain. And I'm sure you'll agree that if that's had the same level of detail and accurate research as we've seen tonight, it should be a fascinating event. If you want to find out more about heritage events, please join our LinkedIn group on the Royal Aeronautical Society page, where we'll be publishing details of forthcoming lectures and also other useful heritage events that might be of more general interest. But with that, thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again at a future heritage lecture. Thank you all very much.